Our last lecture of the year, we're going to talk about globalization. Globalization is the idea that the world has come together to such a degree that we're all interconnected, that you can find a McDonald's in America and you can find the same McDonald's in Shangri-La, so to speak. It's all over the place. And so what I've done for the first slide here is just to talk about kind of the overall idea of AP world history. In period one, we saw hunter-gatherer societies starting to move towards farming and coming together into larger, more permanent settlements. And so, again, the big theme of this class is people coming together and interacting. And in period one, it was at a very local scale where people come together and they start interacting and cities start growing and very local trade starts to happen. And then we saw in period two, the classical age, we saw large-scale civilizations occur, and we started to see the beginnings of long-distance trade, long-distance interaction. And so whether it's the Silk Roads or whatever, we see people constantly throughout world history coming together a little bit more and more and more. By period three, we see lots more long-distance trade, not just the Silk Roads, but we see trans-Saharan trade, Indian Ocean trade, and again, the theme of AP world history continues. People are coming together more and more and more over time. In period four, that's where we see the most drastic change so far. We see now it's not just the Eastern Hemisphere by itself and the Western Hemisphere by itself. In period four, we see the exploration happen, and so now we see the entire world being closer and closer knit together. Next, we see period five, and the world becomes closer and is smaller, if you will, because we see new industry that's going to allow us to go from one end of the world to the other relatively quickly. And so we see empires that don't just take up a region, they take up the entire world, like the British Empire. And so the world is becoming closer and closer together. So the time we get to period six, we see globalization, where the world instantaneously, you can talk to somebody across the world. You can get on a plane and fly around the world in a few hours. And so the world is becoming closer and closer together as we've gone through this class. And so what has allowed that to happen in period six? Why in period six is the world so tightly knit together? And it's technology, especially transportation. And so we go from the very beginning of the time period, we see the internal combustion engine is invented. It's the automobile. And so now people don't have to worry about hitching up a horse. They can go and they don't have to worry about the transportation getting tired. You just put more gas in that engine, you can go for a long time. And so as time goes on, obviously the internal combustion engine gets better and the cars or trucks get bigger. And so now we can we can make goods in Alabama, put them on a truck, and within a few hours they're in Colorado. So more and more interconnected. We also see this in flight. At the beginning of the time period, we see in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright are the first guys to put together the first plane. And it doesn't last very long. It's like a 30-second flight. They get about 11 feet off the ground. But that starts the trend till today. We see huge jetliners who can, like I said, go around the world in a matter of hours. And so, again, you can get people or goods or diseases or ideas, and you can get them on a plane, and they can travel halfway around the world, all the way around the world in a matter of hours. We are more and more interconnected. We also see this in naval or maritime technology. At the start of the time period, we have these big, huge ships. This is the Titanic here on the bottom left. But now we have these big, huge cargo ships. And this is how most of the world's commerce is done today. Something is made in Taiwan with cheap labor. It's put on one of these cargo boats. It goes anywhere you need to in the world in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and we see that these things are offloaded. So really everything that you could have on today could be made in another country. And so again, more interconnectedness. So that's it for transportation. Let's talk about communication, where you can communicate ideas quickly. And so at the start of the time period, we're seeing people get radios. So we're using radio waves bouncing around the atmosphere to somebody could say something in New York and in Los Angeles. You could hear it almost instantaneously. So ideas can travel around the world at a much faster rate. And then in about the 1950s, we see people start to use television more widely, so in the middle of this period six. And so here we have people in some African village far off, a long ways away from anybody else, but yet they're still able to watch maybe reruns of Friends or Seinfeld or pick your, American Idol or whatever. And so we see the world being more and more interconnected, not just across a continent, but all around the world. And then, of course, we get satellites, which travels almost at the speed of light. We can transmit from one part of the world, bounce it off a satellite, and go to another. Those satellites can also do cell phone communication. And so ideas are rapidly traveling around the world, changing the way people think, the new ideas they come up with. Cultures are spreading a lot quicker. Movies, radio, television, satellites, cell phones, all of these things make the world more and more similar as we go through time. And so here we see a person in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and he's using a cell phone. This is an example of being interconnected. And of course, the last big thing we have in period 6 so far is the internet. And so you could be a Buddhist monk in Nepal, and you could be, surfing the internet, finding out the same information that somebody in Los Angeles is finding out. And so ideas spread quickly, culture spreads quickly, and the idea of globalization is that as this process continues, maybe we'll have one world culture where everybody is the same and all these ethnic differences start to fade away, all of these regional or country differences start to fade away, and we all become the same as far as culture goes because we're all exposed to the same ideas. So here's another example of culture spreading. It's been on the AP exam before. It's an American doll, Barbie, and so she represents American culture, but yet she's going to go around the world with trade, and she is going to be slightly adapted to fit other cultures. And so this is an example of cultural diffusion. Remember, we've talked about it this year, that you take what you like from other cultures. It's kind of like a buffet, and you put on your plate what you like and reject what you don't. So the girls in Arabian countries, they like Barbie. Who doesn't like to play with a doll if you're a girl? And so you put a hijab on her, and all of a sudden it's something that's acceptable for your culture. So you take the Barbie and you add something from your culture. We see, here's a kid listening to American music in Japan. Michael Jackson is huge in Japan, and so it's a part of American culture traveling around the world. AP also wants you to know about reggae. Reggae is a form of protest music that starts in the Caribbean. We see African Americans, descendants of slaves in the Caribbean, still living in poverty, and so it's all about kind of singing about your woes, your troubles. No woman, no cry. Whether it's you've got troubles of the heart or you've got troubles because you're oppressed, and you sing about it, and then that spreads to Africa because there are African Americans there that can identify with African Americans in the Caribbean, and reggae catches on in Africa. Here is a French reggae band, and so we see French guys and they're dressing up like Bob Marley, this reggae artist, even though they're white, and they're embracing his culture and his ideas and his outlook on life. So reggae is something that will bounce around the world. Then we get Bollywood. So we have, of course, Hollywood in Los Angeles. It's a center for American-style movies. And in India, they like those movies, but they want to put their own cultural twist on it, kind of like the Barbie. And so we see Bollywood is a center for filmmaking in South Asia that has taken a lot of the ideas from Hollywood, except now we see that there's just an Indian twist on how we want movies to kind of be structured and end. But the idea is the same. We have a cultural center to make movies. So this slide, I'm not going to show you. It was just a picture of some Jewish young men in Israel, and they were doing some rap and some beatbox and some hip hop dancing right there in Jerusalem as an example of how American culture has spread all around the world. And so that's it for technology and music. But also science has become increasingly rapid in this time. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, people are doing more and more scientific advancements. And science happens when you can get ideas from other people and build on them and change things. And then somebody else hears about your idea. And they think, ooh, that's a good idea. And then they make new things themselves. And of course, the pace of science has increased as our communication has increased. And so if somebody in India comes up with the idea of green technology or green revolution, which we talked about in our last lecture, then American scientists are like, yeah, we could totally genetically modify this corn and make it a super corn, make it grow faster, bigger, be resistant to certain weeds or pesticides or insects. And so we see the green revolution starts in India and starts to spread around the world, especially with genetically modified organisms, where we genetically change what's inside the crop to make it more easier to produce and more plentiful. We see that wheat yields around the world have gone up since the Green Revolution. For the same reason, we are genetically modifying the wheat, we're using new pesticides, we're doing new farming techniques, and these are spreading all over the world from India to Mexico, Latin America, the United States. And food production is going up, which is a good thing because the world's population is going up. So we see these two trends kind of go together. You can't have one without the other. If you see the world population go up, you have to have an increase in food production. And so sometimes this may be called yet another agricultural revolution. We had the first one with the Neolithic Revolution, and then we had the second agricultural revolution right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which we started to have machines help us make food. And now we have our third agricultural revolution, or the Green Revolution. We're able to start producing more food by using GMOs or fertilizers, or better farming techniques so we can feed the increasing world population. So next up, Section B. So that's about technology and so forth. Section B is about trade and business. As the world gets closer and closer together and more interdependent, we're going to see that trade will go up to meet all of these demands of this growing population and this increasingly interconnected world. And so AP wants you to know that there are these things called regional trade agreements. It's regions of the planet where countries in that region have decided that they're going to drop tariffs, they're going to drop taxes on imports, and they're going to say we have free trade. So if you make something, let's look at NAFTA. It stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. If you make a good in Mexico, then we're going to allow you to ship it to the United States or Canada with no taxes at the border, with very few regulations going between countries, because that when trade goes up, it means people have a better standard of living. They can get goods cheaper. Like I had talked about in a previous slide, people in Mexico have a lower standard of living, so you can pay them less. So if I'm an American manufacturer, I locate my business in Mexico. They make, shoes, and they send them to the United States cheaply because the labor was cheap. We see the same thing in Europe with the EU. It's a free trade zone. In Southeast Asia, in the bottom left-hand corner, or in Latin America with Mercosur. And so we see that all of these different trade organizations are happening where people are trading. And so as we get into globalization, trade becomes easier, faster. There are fewer political boundaries you have to cross. So, of course, if trade is going up, we're going to get a continuation of what we saw started in period 5, multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, if you remember, are corporations that have their headquarters in one country, but then do business all around the world. And as we trade more, you could imagine that we're going to get these really super big companies. In period 5, where we saw industrialization start, remember the overall trend in business was that businesses get bigger through competition. The big businesses gobble up the weak or smaller businesses, and we get this thing called consolidation. Companies keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we see that trend continue because it works. We still have industrialization. We're just getting better transportation. And so a good example of this is Shell Oil. Shell is headquartered in the Netherlands. It's an oil company. It's called Royal Dutch Shell. It's the 5th largest company in the world. It's a company there as far as money and number of employees and places they go. And everything on the map is showing you a place where Shell does business, either because they're headquartered or they have oil drilling there or refineries. And so it is a multinational corporation, and we see these become bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on. So there's this new trend that we talk about. As companies are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, will there be a day in the future where companies are more important than countries? Where companies become so powerful that they're really more powerful than any state, any country, because they have so many people employed around the world, so much money, so much economic influence. And so we call this corporate imperialism. It's an idea where instead of countries go out and conquer the world, we have companies go out and conquer the world. And so that's something that geographers and historians are thinking may be a trend in the future. So more multinational corporations, just to talk about on an essay. We see Sony. Of course, Sony is headquartered in Japan, but they make goods all over the world and they sell goods all over the world. Another one could be Coca-Cola. We see it. Coca-Cola is an American company headquartered in Atlanta, but we see on this map that Coca-Cola is sold all over the world, and the redder the country, the more people drink Coca-Cola. So we see there are some parts of the world that are white that don't drink Coke at all, but most of the people in the world, if you want a Coke, you can get a Coca-Cola. And so it's made in all parts of the world, it's sold in all parts of the world, there's advertising all over the place, multinational corporations. Next, we have medicine. Obviously, ever since the scientific revolution, people have a better understanding of the human body and viruses and bacteria, and so medicine has gone up quite a bit. Since medicine is getting better and better and better, people have a higher standard of living. And so the population of the world has gone up not only because we have more food, we have more trade, we have more goods, but because we have more medicine. People are just not dying at the rates they used to. A great example of that is in the 1950s, a guy by the name of Jonas Salk, S-A-L-K, he invented a vaccine for a deadly disease that was horrible for children. It was called polio. It affected the nervous system and it made you crippled. And so here he is, this kid is getting a vaccine, and now this whole disease is wiped out. Nobody gets polio anymore, really, because we have modern science has conquered that disease. Another one is antibiotics. What we see is that in World War II, there is a need to. There's all these people getting infections and they're getting cuts and bruises because they're in a war, and so we see that penicillin is invented. Penicillin is going to be something that can kill bacteria. So all of a sudden, it's that's why it's an antibiotic. And now, if you get a scratch or you get a cut, you're not going to probably die from it because they just give you penicillin and it clears up the infection, and so you're a lot more likely to live. In the 1980s, scientists and doctors even go so far as to invent the first artificial heart. And this trend is just continuing. There is some speculation now that what they can do is use a 3D printer to make a new heart for you out of actual cells. So they'll take some stem cells and they'll put them through a 3D printer, and they can just replicate your own heart. So if your heart runs out, you can put a new one in, or a new kidney, or a new liver. So it seems like the boundaries of science are just getting pushed back, and so people are going to have longer, hopefully happier, healthier lives. So as all of this advances in science is going on, we also see that there are some new challenges, though, in science. As we get better at trying to cure diseases, of course, viruses are always mutating and popping up. And so there are some diseases that have been very resistant to being cured. One of those is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a lung disease, and if you look in the industrial world on this map, you'll see it's gray. There are very few cases of tuberculosis because we have medicine to help cure it and we know how it spreads. But if you go to the poorer parts of the world, if you go to Africa or Asia or parts of Latin America that haven't industrialized and haven't modernized as much, we see that this is a disease that is still current. So in period 6, the wealthier parts of the world have wiped out some diseases, but in period 6, some of the parts of the world that haven't quite reached that stage of development are still suffering from the diseases that can be cured in other parts of the world. Another one is cholera. So another example of this disease is cholera. Cholera is a waterborne disease that you get feces in your drinking water, and it kills people, and it can be easily prevented if you have modern infrastructure, if you have clean drinking water systems, and that's a major problem, of course, in lots of parts of the world, especially in Africa, where the governments are either too disorganized, too warlike, or too weak to build new water treatment facilities, drainage systems. And so we don't see a lot of cholera, like I said, in the industrial part of the world, in the modern part of the world, but we still see it as a resistant disease in the rest of the world due to poverty. And of course, malaria. Now, we talked about malaria. We can find a cure for malaria way back in period 5, and that's what allowed us to imperialize Africa, to get in there. And white people, Europeans, were not very resistant to malaria, and so they would die and they wouldn't get into Africa. But in period 5, we got quinine, and so we have a way to keep from getting malaria. But again, in the poorer parts of the world, people are still getting malaria because they don't have access to modern medicine and quinine. We have pesticides now that will kill mosquitoes, which carry the disease. And so it's very rare for somebody in the United States to get malaria. But like I said, you go to poorer areas where they can't afford these pesticides or the medication, and we see that people are still dying from these diseases. So next, so we've talked about on the previous slide diseases that are still affecting poor people. What about diseases that are affecting rich people? There are diseases that are more associated with the modern industrialized world that aren't associated with the poor part of the world. And it's because of lifestyle choices. We see heart disease. In the United States, heart disease is a major problem, and in some countries, poor countries, it isn't much of a problem at all. And if you look at this map of the United States, it shows you heart disease incidences by county, and you notice that a lot of the heart diseases in America are in the South. And it's because of diet. People in the South, they're in a a wealthy country, they have access to all kinds of food that they'd like. And so Southern culture says to have a lot of fried food, and fried food is bad for your heart. It causes cholesterol. And so this is a disease that you wouldn't have access to in some poor country because maybe all you're eating is rice, and so you're not eating a lot of fried food. You just don't have access to it, and so you're not going to have as much heart disease. The next one we get is type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes can be caused by a poor diet, overweight, eating too much bad food for you. And so again, we see that this is a disease, type 2 diabetes, that is associated with industrial, more modern world, where they have access to all of this different kind of food, and so they get obese, or they have access to a lot of foods that are bad for you, high in sugar. And so we see this is a type of disease associated with a more modern world that has a poor diet, oddly enough. Alzheimer's is also something associated with the more industrial parts of the world. Now, we're not exactly sure why this is. It could be because people in the more industrial world live longer, and so they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's when they get older. Maybe it is a dietary issue. We're not exactly sure, but Alzheimer's is more of a problem in the industrial world than it is in the developing world. So the next thing is impact on the environment. And so in period 6, of course, we have, in period 5, the Western world industrialized, but now in period 6, we're going to see that the rest of the world is industrializing too, India, China, so forth. And so when you have the West already pumping out all kinds of pollution because of factories, and now other parts of the world like India, China, Indonesia start to industrialize too, that just doubles, quadruples the amount of pollution in the atmosphere. And so we see that in order to run all of these factories, of course, we burn fossil fuels, whether it's petroleum, oil, or it's coal. Those are the two biggest fossil fuels that we burn. We see that this puts all kinds of greenhouse gases and pollution in the atmosphere. And so what you see on the bottom is China, which is industrialized in period 6. We see that this is right on the bottom right-hand picture. That is noon in Beijing. And what you're seeing there is not fog, it's pollution. And on the left-hand side, you see a satellite view, and this is all just clouds of pollution. So it's a major problem as the rest of the world starts to industrialize. And as I said before, all this pollution, not only is it bad for you to breathe and can cause lung cancer, but also it causes greenhouse gases, all of burning these fossil fuels, which means that the atmosphere is going to heat up because the greenhouse gases will work to hold in the heat of the sun. And so the heat just kind of gets trapped, and the Earth's temperature slowly rises. Well, actually, it's not so slow. The average temperature of the Earth has been going up for the last few years, and this is a real concern. What are we going to do? Are we going to be a victim of our own industrial success? Ocean levels may rise because the Earth's atmosphere is getting warmer, so the glacier ice pack melts. We have more extreme weather because there's more energy in the atmosphere with all of this heat. And so it's something that is becoming a major concern here in the 2000s. So to fix that, in 1997, we have the Kyoto Protocol or the Kyoto Accords, where most of the countries in the world signed an agreement that they will try to slowly reduce greenhouse gases so that we won't have more global warming. But the United States and Canada have so far refused to sign that because we want cheap goods. We need lots of fossil fuels to continue to have a high standard of living, and we don't want it to cost jobs, and so we see that the world is not kind of all on the same page here, so it's another thing that continues to be a problem that we need to watch in the future. Next, deforestation. Now, of course, we have been deforesting the world ever since we started agriculture. And we talk about slash and burn farming, or people cutting down cropland to terrace farming, or what have you. So people have been deforesting for a long time to feed their increasingly growing population. But with the world's population skyrocketing in period 6 and continuing to go up into the 21st century, we see big parts of the rainforests of the world be deforested, mostly to create land to raise cattle. And so big parts of the Amazon rainforest is being cleared at a rapid pace so we can have open land to feed the people of the world. But the rainforests of the world provide us most of our oxygen. And so we see with greenhouse gas emissions and the decrease in oxygen, we see things have certainly heated up in the environment. The air itself is changing over the last half century. Now, when you have deforestation for ranching and farming, you're also going to have another reason for deforestation is we need the raw materials. We need the wood for all of these people's homes, for paper, for what have you. We log these areas out, not just for ranching and farming, but also for housing construction. When you do this, of course, it causes soil erosion, which also causes the extinction of plant species, animal species, insects, birds, those kinds of things. And so we see the extinction rate in the world rapidly rising. And this is a concern because we don't want to lose some of these animals, and some of these plants could possibly hold the cure for some horrible disease. So the race is on to try to save the rainforest, but still to maintain our standard of living and have the jobs that depend on gathering some of these resources. So it's a question of what do we value more as a society. And we certainly need jobs, but we also need to protect the environment too. And so governments are struggling with that decision. Now, whenever we have deforestation and soil erosion, we have desertification. Desertification can be caused because you're cutting down the trees and so there's nothing to hold the soil in. And so when the wind blows, the soil just gets in the wind and we start to see a desert occur. It can also be caused because of changing climate. As the world heats up, we see the Sahara Desert getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And this means that's less land for people to be able to farm on, as usable land to graze animals, to farm, those kinds of things. And so we see the world getting hotter and drier due to overgrazing, also because of logging, like I said, changing in climate. Poor farming methods can also cause this too. And people's need to get more farmland, they'll cut down the native vegetation and they'll plant crops, but again, now there's nothing holding that soil in place, so when the wind goes, all that soil just gets whipped away and you get sand dunes and desertification. And we talked about greenhouse gases. Next up, water. Water is the most precious resource on planet Earth. People think it's oil, but we need water to live, and there's not that much available drinking water. A lot of salt water, but nothing that we can, you can't drink salt water. And so we see that the amount of water available for an increasingly growing world population is shrinking because, one, factories when they burn fossil fuel, that puts all kinds of pollutants in the air. That air gets in the clouds, and then it rains, and then those pollutants get into our water supply. And so that's a concern. Also, we see factories dumping chemicals into the water supply. You have to use chemicals to make certain products, and so that gets in the drinking supply too. And so we see that the lack of drinkable water is a major concern for many people around the world, not just in industrial countries, but certainly in non-industrial countries where people may have to walk 10 miles a day to go get enough drinking water to just drink, let alone wash their clothes and those kinds of things. And poor countries can't afford water treatment plants. They don't have a strong enough government to say to factories, you can't pollute this area. And so it's a major concern for many countries around the world. Next up, because of all of these challenges to the environment, in period 6 we've seen an environmental movement. About in the 1960s, 1970s, and then beyond, we see this idea that people in more developed countries, they realize that we need to do something to save our planet because we depend on our planet with the plants, the animals, the drinking water. And so in 1970, we had the first Earth Day telling people to renew, reuse, recycle. Next, in 1977 in Kenya, we see the Green Belt movement occur. It's mostly women who do this, and they are going to plant 40 million trees. They see that their environment is being destroyed in Kenya. Now, one of Kenya's main industries is tourism. People want to come and they go on safari and see the animals of Africa. But the animals were dying because people were cutting down trees for farming and for grazing for their cattle. And so we see fewer giraffes, rhinos, those kinds of things. And so the women of Kenya realize that they need to keep their forests so that their main industry, tourism, can attract more and more people to come in. And so we see the Kenyan Greenbelt movement to try to reestablish native plants and plants to keep the animals healthy and alive. Then we see Greenpeace is created in 1971. Now, this is a more radical movement than the environmental movement. Greenpeace is a group of protesters who will go out and try to get in the way of technology or get in the way of industry. So here we see in the top right-hand corner, these are whalers. These are people that go out and they look for whales in the ocean to kill, to butcher, and then to sell for their meat or for their oil or what have you. And so the Greenpeace movement is going to get on boats and they're going to try to scare away the whales to disrupt what's going on here. And we see the whalers trying to get rid of the protesters by spraying water on them. In the bottom left-hand corner, we see people protesting U.S. Carrier because it uses nuclear energy, and they don't want people to use nuclear energy because what do you do with all the nuclear waste when you're done? It's highly radioactive. And so we see protesters going out and becoming radicalized as they try to forcefully stop countries and industries from polluting the environment. So, as I said all of this, there is still a desire for more fossil fuels because the world's population, as you can see on that map of the world at night, is growing, especially in the industrialized world where you see all the lights. And so as the world's population continues to grow, people are going to want a higher standard of living, whether you're in the United States or in Kenya or Uganda or Costa Rica. In order to get that higher standard of living, you have to have factories. You have to have energy for lighting and cooling and heating. And so we see that we have been increasingly using fossil fuels, which causes greenhouse gases, whether it's oil or coal. We also see people using lots of atomic energy in the bottom. And of course, that's good. You can heat or light a lot of homes with atomic energy with very little fuel. But then what do you do with all the radioactive waste? And so the search is on to find a better energy source, a renewable energy source that you can use to power the world's energy needs without polluting the world. And so in the bottom right-hand corner, we see windmills. You also can use wave power, solar energy. These are all alternative energy sources that maybe hopefully someday can replace fossil fuels without all the negative consequences. Next, we have Humanitarian Organizations. So we have talked a lot about the 20th century, period 6. We've talked about the wars and the genocide and the diseases and starvation. And so the UN, of course, was created after World War II to try to make the world a better place. And so the UN will create a bunch of organizations to try to help feed children and spread medical care around the world. And so one of them is called UNICEF. The UN is for United Nations. And so we see UNICEF will raise money from the developed countries of the world to go and send doctors and nurses and aid workers around the world to help children get better health care and also better food, so to help them have a healthier, longer life. Next, we get the WHO. It's also another UN organization, the World Health Organization. It is going to go around the world and try to eradicate diseases. So not just for children like UNICEF, but for adults too. And so if there's an outbreak of Ebola, the World Health Organization will send UN volunteers to Liberia or the Ivory Coast or wherever the Ebola outbreak is and try to contain the disease and eradicate it. Next, we see NGOs. NGO stands for non-governmental organizations. They're private organizations that are created to try to help the world. So the most famous one of these is the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. These are organizations that were started back in period 5 but continue today, and they try to go help people in need. So if you're in a Muslim country, the Red Crescent will come in. If you're in another country, the Red Cross will come in. And if there's a flood or an earthquake, they will try to organize relief efforts. If there's a big tsunami, they'll come in with medicine and clean drinking water and try to help the world become a better place. The next one we see is Doctors Without Borders, a very popular program. We see lots of U.S. doctors, Canadian doctors, English doctors from developed worlds. They dedicate part of their time, and they may take a month, a year or so, and they'll go help deliver vaccines or help cure people in less developed parts of the world who don't have a very large doctor population to help all of these people, and they'll usually bring medicines with them. Next, and so that's medical stuff. Well, what about political problems? And so we see non-governmental organizations. These are just private organizations of people who have a desire to help the world be a better place. And so we get Amnesty International. It's an organization to try to go in the world and protect human rights. And so let's say you live in a country where there's ethnic conflict or genocide, or the government is abusing people and torturing people. So Amnesty International will try to come in and they will try to stop that torture, hence the barbed wire that you see around the candle of hope. And so this is a picture trying to people that you can't turn your back on violence. You have to turn around and try to stop it. And so that's Amnesty International. So next, culture. As the West becomes more and more successful in period 5 and 6 and goes and conquers the world, they won't not just conquer the world with their economy and their industry and their politics and their armies. They're also going to spread their culture around the world. And so if you're in Africa and you're in some small classroom, you're going to get introduced to Western culture, literature, music, art, by using a modern Kindle or a notebook. Here we see in the top right-hand corner, Min in, I think it was Dubai, and there's an American-style mall there. And so we see that the West's idea that if you buy things, you're more happy and more successful, that idea of consumerism, that buying things makes you happy, that we see that spreading around the world as the rest of the world becomes more industrialized too, and they want to copy that American or Western success. Now, not everybody in the world believes that this is a good idea, and so especially in the Middle East in the 1970s, as they see American culture growing and influencing their children, as we see American military power increase in the region, we talked about that in the last lecture, and American economic might increasing in their region, they see that their culture is being subdued by American culture too. Their children want to speak English, go to see American movies, go to listen to American artists, and so we see Islamic fundamentalism result as a reaction against the West, trying to say, look, the West, you're culturally, economically, socially, politically powerful, but you're not going to take over our part of the world. And so we see them burning an American flag, Mr. Obama's picture there, and so we see that's kind of the reaction against globalization and the spread of Western culture. Next, spread of sports around the world. There are some sports that are going to have worldwide appeal, like football or what we call soccer, and so it's going to bring the world actually together. It's going to be a unifying thing. That we have the World Cup, and for several weeks during a summer every 4 years, we see people, soccer fans from all over the world, come together and root on their country. And so that's something that's bringing the world together. Another event that brings the world together in sports is the Olympics. We see people, the idea of the Olympics is to create a time of peace where everybody can come together and have friendly competition in sports. And so we see, again, globalization bringing the world together.